Welcome everyone to the post-lunch party. You ready? You ready? We have an exciting panel here, except for me. But I think the topic today will hopefully be engaging. We're going to be talking about housing, and specifically, we're going to talk about housing as an investment that achieves social and environmental return as well as financial return. And one of the exciting things to me about this panel, I've been in housing for probably longer than you can even imagine, is that when I started in housing, you could count the number of investment vehicles that were available to institutional investors on like two hands. And now I would say that there's been a proliferation of them, and they meet a variety of impact criteria, but most importantly, they meet a variety of fiduciary needs for different types of investors. And those are the two things we're going to talk about on this panel. So I want to start by allowing each of our panel members to say a little bit about their business and what they do, and then we will go into a discussion of those two topics. My goal is for us to be finished in time to allow at least 15 or 20 minutes of questions and discussion from you all. We're going to keep it pretty informal and lively. I've asked people to be provocative on everything except politics. We'll see if we succeed. I doubt it, knowing this crew. But why don't we start with you, Michael? Michael Saadine is with Bridges Ventures.
Bridges Fund Management, rebranded.
Sorry.
All right. So Bridges was founded in the UK in '02. As you guys know in this industry, Europe has been ahead of us. So has been operating there really two main fund strategies, what we call the growth funds, which are effectively lower middle market private equity type vehicles, and the real estate funds as well, which is where I sit. And then outside of that, we have our Impact Plus function, which does quite a bit of external advisory on social impact, as well as supporting our investment teams on the impact side. So in the US, we launched a growth fund 3 years ago, and we launched the real estate fund a year ago. The U.S. real estate strategy, a lot of the impact space in U.S. real estate is either 100% about environmental sustainability or focused on affordable housing. Our capital is really market rate, conventional type money. So we can't do capital A affordable housing. We're not tax credit investors. And we are thinking about sustainability beyond just environmental. We're thinking about social and economic issues. So from an impact perspective, we're kind of seeking outcomes like affordability, whether it's sitting in a blended building that has some affordability, some market rate. We're thinking about job creation, and we're also thinking a lot about place and just generally being an economic catalyst in neighborhoods that need it. So we're investing across asset classes. We're usually going to work with local JV sponsors and be their equity source. And on the housing side, deals that make sense for us are either mixed income housing, workforce housing that has some value add, or even fully market rate housing if we think that it's kind of a shot in the arm to a neighborhood rather than a gentrification play. So the how comes into it quite a bit.
Great, thank you. Great description. David Sand?
That's my introduction.
That's
David
yours.
Sand. You said where he worked. So, David Sand, Community Capital Management. We are based in Florida. I work in our Boston office. We are a money management firm doing fixed income impact investing. We've been doing it for a long time. We manage about $2.5 billion of U.S.-based fixed income investing that is both place-based and impact themes oriented. We work with clients on 17 possible impact themes that we can assemble portfolios on their behalf. Over 50% of what we do is affordable housing as we define it, which is either affordable home ownership to low and moderate income home buyers or affordable rental housing for rental properties that have either income ceilings or some form of subsidy or public assistance, or in many cases both. One of the impact themes that I hope we have a chance to talk about later today that is one of our most rapidly growing ones is gender lens, and we've been able to do some very innovative work in affordable home ownership for women-headed households. Thanks.
Great. Doug Lawrence, 5 Pound Green.
Hi, everybody. Before I get started, I just want to say I'm really encouraged when I look around this room about what's coming to solve our problems in this country. I mean, women, men, black, white, yellow, Hispanic, everybody's here, and that is what I think we need, because we have some big challenges ahead of us. So thank you. Let me applaud you guys. I probably have the simplest story here. We are a green real estate equity investor, and we approach what we do from an asset management perspective. So we focus on operations, which makes us very technologically oriented to applying technology to cut the cost of energy, water, and waste in our buildings and make them healthier and better to run. And ultimately, the way we apply this, we're projecting returns for affordable housing, workforce housing, and light industrial in the projected 35% range. What we offer is about an 18% return, and we're hitting those targets. We're hitting those targets because we're working very closely with cities, one-on-one, hand-to-hand. We work very closely with our developers in getting the land numbers right. And because we're green, we're able to attract capital, often from public utilities, to create energy efficiency and reduce our overall need for additional commercial debt. So we reduce risk, we embed return, we produce affordable housing, workforce housing, and light industrial.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Great. Jonathan Asmis. I work at a company called Landed. So a little different in that only 18 months of operating history. Also a little different in that probably the more, a little complex. But at its basic level, we help teachers buy homes. That's what we do. Especially in expensive places. And the way that we do that is we run down payment assistance programs with school districts and charter schools. Essentially what we do is we allow fiduciaries, large institutional real estate investors to invest alongside teachers as they go to buy homes so that they ultimately get exposure to the underlying land. They take long duration inflation risk alongside people that have very stable income, and non-cyclical, for the most part, employment. So we do this now in the Bay Area. We're working with almost every school district in the Bay Area, a whole bunch of private schools as well, and are just moving to LA, Denver, Seattle now.
Great. You probably noticed in just the 4 people that were here that we have several different definitions of affordable housing. So I just want to check in and see how many people in the audience work in housing or invest in housing. All right, so you all probably have some things to teach us and some knowledge about what we mean by when we say affordable housing. But maybe since about 2/3 of the room is not that familiar with affordable housing, I'll take a minute to do an affordable housing 101. So the definition of affordable housing, using kind of the standard governmental standards, is that your housing costs are no more than 30% of your income. And so if you're high income, that means one thing, but if you make $100,000 a year, that means that you would be paying no more than $33,000 a year for housing costs, including utilities combined. And so you need a home that would rent for less than $3,000 a month. In most major cities, that's pretty challenging. $100,000 is around the area median income for San Francisco and New York, and they calculate those based on the whole metropolitan region. So that means that folks that work minimum wage jobs have extreme challenges in finding that affordability. And so there's a number of subsidy programs that help support those folks. So folks that are making at the poverty level and below, if they're going to have affordable homes, it's generally, in high-cost cities, it's generally subsidized housing. But for folks that are more right around the median income, a lot of times there's a couple of other ways that people achieve affordability. One that Jonathan was talking about in terms of down payment assistance for affordable housing. David works with government-backed mortgages that provide both rental and homeownership with lower interest loans. And then in many metropolitan regions, maybe just outside some of the high-cost cities and in other regions, there's what a lot of people refer to as workforce housing or naturally occurring affordable housing. And that's generally housing that doesn't have a government subsidy associated with it. It's most often affordable multifamily housing, rental housing, and it's rents that are affordable to someone making less than the median income. The statistics that I've heard, I don't know if it's still true, it may be a little bit old, is that about 80% of multifamily apartments in the United States are affordable to families making less than 80% of area median income. So that's a huge stock. It's unsubsidized. It doesn't mean that it is sustainable or great places for everyone to live. Those are often in places that are far flung from transportation and jobs. So all of us work on those different types of affordability in different ways and expect different kinds of outcomes in terms of impacts and environmental sustainability from those. So I want to spend this first part of the conversation talking about the various ways that the panel members think about impact. I suppose I should also introduce myself. So I actually just started a new job. I am with PGIM Real Estate, which is the traditional real estate investment division of Prudential. We invest third-party capital, fiduciary capital in real estate, and it's a fairly traditional real estate shop. PGIM has been undertaking an initiative to build an impact strategy in the last year, and they hired me to help start to create a new fund and execute on that strategy, so kind of at the beginning. But when I first started coming to High Water Women, I was at the Ford Foundation working in their housing and community development finance portfolio and helping to start their impact investing initiative. So it's really great to see how this group and the conversation has evolved in the last 4 years. What I would say is that it's much more oriented towards market rates of return and a lot more variety of product up on the stage and in the panels. So I would echo Doug's sentiments that thank you all for being here, and for those of you who've been coming for several years, thanks for helping to put this on and make it. It's really becoming kind of an institution, something that people talk about throughout the year. So let's shift to talking about impact and how each of you think about impact. David, you mentioned in your opening remarks that you have a number of impact themes. If you could tell us what that means, and then talk about some of the themes that, like gender lens investing, that might be a little bit unexpected for housing.
Sure, thanks. We start with a very wide lens because our clients are interested in investing and helping to make their communities and the world a better place at the same time. So that sounds fairly infinite, fairly global. It gets very narrow, very filtered very quickly because, exactly like Lisa said, we're making market rate investments, and our philosophy and style has the further complication that we are also doing high credit quality. So while we are investing in loans that may on their own be high risk, first-time home buyers, non-traditional families, sustainability, sustainable agriculture, things like that, we're also very involved in getting those whole loans, if you will, collateral credit enhanced so that we can invest in portfolios, both in the mutual fund that we run and in the separate accounts that we run, that are bond-like portfolios that investors can own within their fixed income asset allocation that they have with their investment committees and consultants. So what we've done in defining impact, the history and heritage of the firm is based on geography. So we started working for investors, financial institutions, foundations, family offices who had a deep affinity or connection to the city of New York, the state of California, eastern Tennessee, had to be within the United States, had to be something that could be identified on a map. And that's really what we spent close to a decade working on. More recently, call it the last 10 years or so, 5 to 10 years, as impact has grown in part through the efforts of conferences like this, we've added the impact theme. So within the context of geography within the United States, there are also themes like affordable housing, sustainability, sustainable agriculture, minority communities, healthcare, supportive housing, and the gender lens, just very quickly, because it seems like it's a little bit connected to what we're all here to talk about today. We've had lots of clients who'd asked us to do what's now sort of come under the umbrella of gender lens, but focus specifically on women. We had foundation clients whose programmatic effort was all oriented towards women and families. and children's and the communities in which they live. Those of you know the mortgage world, the home ownership world, you can get a huge amount of information about a borrower, financial information, geographic information, FICO scores, all the good geeky stuff that makes up the mortgage-backed security world. Because of the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, you're not able to find out gender information. So we operated for over a decade with the assumption, which unfortunately we think is a valid assumption, that in our society, the poorer you are, the greater the probability that you are a person of color and that you are female. That seems to be, most people nod their head and say that's true. We really wanted some data, and we also had clients who wanted us to work in a small way towards remediation, if you will. And so what we've been able to do, it's a long story, but we worked with one and now two mortgage originators. We signed a confidentiality agreement and a non-disclosure agreement. So we now see the gender of borrowers, and we've assembled what we think is the first mortgage-backed security pool with a government agency underwriting that's to all female headed household borrowers. And you know, it's a little thing. A lot of what we do in this impact investing is incremental. We think incrementally having the ability to show our clients the affordability and the ability to invest in women who are pretty much exclusively first-time home buyers, you know, is something that we can do now in the field that could not be done when some of us entered it.
So it's a very interesting capital market intervention that's a couple of steps removed from the actual buyers, but I think you all have done a great job of kind of demonstrating the chain that leads to that impact. And, you know, the more demand there is in capital markets for mortgages to women in low-income census tracts, the more those are going to get done. So that's pretty cool. While we're on the home ownership topic, Jonathan, why don't we talk a little bit about, if you could talk a little bit about one of the main issues in terms of social justice and finance, which is the racial wealth gap, and how what you do really allows you to have some impact in that space.
One of my favorite advisors calls us essentially the bank of mom and dad, because most of the ways in which people ultimately access conforming mortgage credit is that they get help from their parents, especially in jumbo markets like California, New York, whether you're talking about Boston or DC. Essentially the way you are accessing a mortgage is you're going to mom and dad, you're asking them for some money. And ultimately, not all of us have equal access to that bank. And actually, as a result, most of the educators we end up working with don't.
I mean, let's be a little bit more specific
Sure.
about that, right? The racial wealth gap in this country is that black families have what percentage of the assets of white families? It's something like, it's a tiny percentage.
Yeah, and so much of this gets propagated from generation to generation.
Right.
Essentially as a result of, you know, collateral. Like, what is collateral? Collateral, and how is collateral passed from, you know, from generation to generation to generation, and how does that help or hurt people's ability to access credit, which allows them to build more collateral, which, you know, so much of it propagates kind of down the line. And in these markets where we operate, there's no real government support, so there's no GSE product, like Fannie, Freddie product that helps people buy $800,000 homes, and which you kind of $800,000 homes. But in these cities, that is the home.
Yeah.
There is no there is no $400,000 home in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, within commutable distance of kind of economic opportunity. And that's, I think, the challenge that we're kind of set out to ultimately face. I think in terms of being like provocative, because we are encouraged to be provocative, the way we view our work is we have one mission, which is we're trying to help build the financial security of essential professionals near the communities in which they serve. But how we ultimately end up talking about that depends on the interest of our funders, depends on the interest of the other side of the question. So sometimes we talk about retention. So schools in these urban areas turn over educators at 30% a year, and if they look at their homeowners, they only turn over at 4% a year, right? So it's like a lot of this is a school quality issue. Sometimes we talk about the fact that most of our borrowers are of families of color or first-generation immigrants because they can't ultimately access this bank of mom and dad. Sometimes we talk about sustainability, because people that buy homes trade usually to live closer to the communities in which they serve. So there's kind of so many layers.
Yeah.
And which kind of layer you ultimately take sometimes is guided by the conversation that other people want to have.
That's great. It's really important to be able to recognize that there's a variety of types of investors interested in a variety of types of impacts. It also makes it challenging if you're trying to do some broad-based tracking and measuring of impact. Michael, Bridges has a really strong history in being able to do that. I know you all have a part of your company that focuses on impact measurement and tracking. Can you talk a little bit about how you do that and how you think about that, and what do you think best practices are for people who are wanting to track and measure impact in their investments?
Sure, and that was, I mentioned in my introduction the Impact Plus division of our company, which works kind of for us and does a bunch of external projects as well. So we're blessed to kind of have some infrastructure of theirs. We have tools. We have what we call our Impact Radar, which we use in the underwriting stage, where we track target outcomes. We track what we call additionality, which is effectively the question of is this deal happening any differently because Bridges is involved? Alignment is another section. It's the concept of, are we trading off between the social and the financial, or do they enhance each other? And lastly, ESG, just kind of being responsible on that side. So we at the beginning of each investment, we track these four items. We rate the potential return and the potential risk. That's our initial radar. And then as we proceed, we have a scorecard with KPIs that we track over year. One of the interesting things about real estate, and one of the things I'm kind of eager to learn from other folks about is that a lot of, at least what we do, which is largely going to be heavy value add or development of real estate, a lot of the impact is baked into the closing of the deal or the development of the deal. For instance, if we're doing a deal like we have in Atlanta with a certain set aside of units that are affordable at 80% AMI, that's a 30-year restriction that's in place when we close. So you don't really need to measure it or track that, right? There are systems in place for that being tracked. And likewise, one of the real things we think about other than affordability in the housing space is place. And if we've kind of studied a neighborhood and we're building a big database and kind of developing our own way of thinking about these economic metrics and going beyond just family income, because I think that's one of the limitations to the government designations. If part of what we're saying is just bringing economic activity into some of these underserved areas is an impact outcome in itself. So a lot of our impact is baked up front, but then there's kind of this whole asset management and how element to it. A lot of that comes down to, we're working with partners that think the same way we do on the ground. And so the day-to-day is connected. No one's going to be fudging these affordability stats. And, we're focused on connections to neighborhoods and making sure, frankly, a lot of the deals we do are going to be right on that fuzzy line between growth and gentrification. And we can't shy away from that because we need economic growth and we have to make market rate returns. But a lot of the day-to-day and the how is how we prevent kind of just being another gentrifier when we're going into some of these tougher neighborhoods.
So you said two things there that I want to ask Doug to comment. You said that you looked for alignment between financial return and impact return. And Doug, you mentioned that in your opening remarks, that's one of your main investment theses for Five Stone Green. And then you also talked about how to track impact, not just once you close the deal, but as the deal is operated, which is really where people's lives are affected. And Doug, I know you have some things, so if you want to elaborate on those two things with regards to
No.
No, all right. Moving along.
Michael raises some really important points, and what is an impact return? It is a job. It is improved health. It's improved scores on your SATs if you're building a building that's a better building. We also think it is lowering the cost of occupancy, but not with government support. We're not certain about government support, either 4% tax credits or 9% tax credits. We don't know if it's going to be there. So what we've been practicing, what we've been doing is working with local government or even utilities to acquire land well below appraised value in great locations near transportation, public transportation. And we've been successful in all of our projects at doing that, so that kind of a rule of thumb, land is about 25% of your overall project cost. In our case, it's 0 to 10%. And then because we are green, we're able to attract, again, from public utilities, endowments, foundations, other sources, but 10 to 15% of our capital is attracted through grants that are non-repayable. And so what we're doing is we're creating an institutional product in terms of risk aversion, right? And then for occupancy costs, because when you build a green building, and Mark, you'll testify to this, you build a green building, your operating expenses come down, your future capital costs come down because you're running better systems longer and cleaner. So I can charge the same rent as the guy across the street, but my margins will be bigger. And that allows me to pass that on to that tenant. And when you do it that way, that you're creating an improvement in the micro gross domestic product. That's what you're doing. You're building wealth for that tenant. And I'm still making a market rate or better return for my LP, my investors, because that's what they really care about. At the end of the day, to be blunt, you go to a pension plan and they're like, what's my return? They don't ask you, what's my impact? If you go to a policeman's pension plan or a fire plan or government employees, even most endowments, they're not going to ask you that question. They want to know what's the return, because their consultants don't ask you that question. Right? So you kind of have to do it and prove to them that you are reducing risk overall by assuming and subsuming all the things you're talking about, that this reduces risk, it reduces the amount of debt you need, which reduces risk, and by getting the subsidies and grants and the land right, you are improving returns materially. That's why I said earlier our returns are projected out at 35%.
I'm convinced. You want some money? So let's move into it's a great segue, Doug, into talking about the investment returns and the profiles of the four types of investments we have up here on the stage. So, David, why and who's going to invest in your fund?
So our clients are looking for financial returns that are what's called core fixed income, U.S. Most of our clients benchmark us to the Bloomberg Barclays U.S. Bond Index, which is the S&P 500 for fixed income. So it's kind of like the 35%, but with maybe a decimal point between the 3 and the 5. That would actually be in a good year. So we have sort of two types of clients that have an appetite for those returns within impact. Some are people for whom just something that is totally conservative, focused on preservation of capital, generates current income, is not likely to be too volatile. That works for them. And certainly that's been kind of our bread and butter over the years. And then more recently, as you have more and more clients who are going all in for impact, as the phrase goes, so looking horizontally across their investment portfolios, trying to achieve, measure, and report upon impact from every asset class. Some of what people are using us for is the boring ballast anchor weight within an impact portfolio that may also have in it illiquid investments, may have investments that have lockouts, may have investments that are outside the U.S. That aren't necessarily responsive to the capital markets, and we can kind of truck along and hit our singles while other people are striking out and hopefully also hitting home runs at the same time.
That's great. So, Michael, who invests in your fund and why? Where does it sit in the portfolio?
Yeah, I think it's a variety, and it's also a variety across Bridges as a whole. I think we run everything from investors who might actually have specific CRA asks and expect some of our deals to get at that,
Sorry, CRA is Community Reinvestment Act. It requires that banks make investments that benefit low-income people.
Yes. We know acronyms, but not what they stand for in this industry.
Just in the community where they're taking money out.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, so that's, I mean, that is an internal debate as to whether we even want that money, but our growth fund has taken some of that. We have folks that are, very much on the impact end of the spectrum, focused on it, that are investing with us. But I think really, at the end of the day, it's going to be a lot of traditional types of groups, foundations, endowments, maybe some pensions, insurance companies, who either want to tick the box on impact, and obviously we're focused on doing more than just checking boxes, or that really like our strategy as a niche play. So we're looking in next tier markets. We're not focused on the gateway cities. We're writing $5 to $20 million checks where most institutions, like my former employer, would not get out of bed for less than a $50 million check. And so we're finding this soft middle in the market that aligns with our impact goals, but it's also a pretty exciting kind of real estate play for these folks that already have X number of $1 billion in the traditional Blackstone, Starwoods, and Northwoods. And part of that is also going and being willing to open our eyes to certain submarkets and locations that the typical New York Fifth Avenue firm is not spending a lot of time in.
It seems like, Doug, you might have some things to say about this.
Oh, I think Michael's spot on. We're small, we're new. We have public pension plan money, we have endowment money, we have a lot of high net worth folks, and friends and family. Mm-hmm. And so, you put your own money in as well, and you're paying attention.
Right.
You're paying attention. Because the kids have to go to college.
For sure.
But the pool of investors is very, very broad. I think it's getting deeper too. Mm-hmm. J.P. Morgan came out with a report about impact and $1 trillion. People are starting to wake up to it. I just don't think it's fast enough.
I think that's right. Yeah.
I think what you're doing is really important. What the three of you are doing is really, really important because you're changing the conversation. And the more we focus on the chief investment officers, the acquisition teams, the folks that are charged as fiduciaries to meet returns, and they realize you're not losing return by also considering impact, the better off we are and the faster capital will come to the sector.
I might add one thing. One of the challenges of the stage we're at, and what we're basically saying is we want to prove this model in the existing construct before we go try to change the construct. Are there deals that are low return and I'd love to hold for 15 years that would transform communities? Absolutely, but that's not kind of the traditional capital that's out there for funds. So what we're kind of doing as an industry, and if anyone's a little more brave or pioneering than we are, is kind of saying, okay, these are the types of funds that are raised, 10-year funds, mid-teen net LP returns, and we're going to show that impact works in that space. And then we might start saying, is there an evergreen vehicle to be built? Is there, a little bit of a concessionary return vehicle to be built?
When we talk about affordable housing, and what Michael's doing again and what you're doing is great because the 7.2 million units needed right now of affordable housing. 7.2 million. That can't be fulfilled in the next 20 years. So if you're going into that space, it's pretty much not that risky. Right? Your demand is there. And Lanier knows this from his days in Newark. Every mayor needs to deliver food, water, electricity, and housing. That's how they get real, or in Chicago.
In a football stadium.
In a football stadium and remove snow in Chicago, right? So, where and how the consultants got control of this industry to say doing good is not doing well, I don't know. But that is the biggest mindset change there is. And
Are there any consultants in the room?
we'll
seriously.
shoot you now.
Well,
Well, it's a problem that they're not here, let me just
Yeah.
say. But it's a huge issue in terms of the gatekeepers and the boxes that we have to fit into. I think what you're hearing, Michael, you're highlighting is that there's a dance that's happening where affordable housing has come closer to the traditional investment vehicles, and the traditional investment vehicles, as they've started to look for non-cyclicality and more value add and a late cycle real estate market where that's challenging to find, have come outside of their boxes, and we're starting to get a little closer to actually dancing together. It's the first movers that are dancing. We need a lot more contestants, I think.
As a quick comment, because we probably have the most non-traditional box that possibly exists, because we have like no coupon and our investments go out potentially to 30 years. So in terms of your comment around like those that are braver, I think it's just those that are more naive, us being one of them. But I think that across very large LPs. Now the question is like there's a whole series of like intermediaries that kind of are meant to represent the interest of the LPs, but might not, based on their incentives. Same with like infrastructure funds. We talk about infrastructure funds all the time. Infrastructure funds are not 10-year funds. They can't really operate on a 2 and 20 basis, considering the returns that they're ultimately targeting. So I think that once you go all the way to the LP, you'll find a receptive audience. At least we generally have. The challenge is, again, is this chicken and egg challenge, which is, you don't get out of bed for less than $50 or $100 million if you're trying to deploy, $400 billion. And so how do you create intermediary sources of capital to get those opportunities up to that level, where ultimately those LPs can make their own decision around whether this hits their kind of risk return targets outside of, okay, but if I'm going to earn carried interest, I'm not going to have a fund that's 40 years long. I mean, I'll be dead by the time the carried interest ultimately hits my book. So I think you have to look at the whole capital stack.
Yep.
Just on that point, in terms of the dialogue and who's talking to who, I thought Valerie Rockefeller this morning, for those of you who were here for the, I guess, second plenary, she talked about how Rockefeller Brothers is requiring the investment staff and the program staff to actually talk to one another, something that may be deja vu, or whatever the opposite of deja vu is from your time at the Ford Foundation. And that's something at Community Capital Management we've been doing with our community foundation clients for a very long time. And you can almost see it happen on people's faces, where the program staff that's been talking about arts in their community and the investment staff that's had nothing to do with any mission-related investments whatsoever, when they come around to realizing that the communities that they're trying to help with the arts, not to pick on the arts, but that without housing and transit-oriented development and other basic services which can be supported through the investments in the market rate portfolio, that unless you put those all together, you're just throwing money away. And so there is more now recognition of at least the validity of having that conversation crossing silos. And if you want to be thankful for small change and incremental change, that's definitely one.
Yeah, there's been a lot of progress, I think. And, some of the foundation presidents, like the Ford Foundation now, have kind of taken the helm and put it out there to bring those two sides together.
Yeah.
So there's some progress. I said we would leave time for audience conversation. We have about 15 minutes left, and so I would love to move to any questions or comments. I can put some audience members on the spot about things we've talked about. Yes, Fran, I was going to call on you.
Oh, my sword. I think the fact that you don't get out of bed for less than $100 million officially makes you the supermodel.
Well, I never said I don't get out of bed. I said that the people we talk to, like when you go to so we have sovereigns. So if you're going to go to the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund and say, I need $20 million.
No, they don't get out of bed.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying I don't get out of bed. If you have $1 million, I will be there on a plane.
No, but Fran, it's an important point, right? It's part of what we're starting to see in the impact space. When we started, it felt like everything was small. Everything was small and beautiful and unique. And we're starting to move into a space. I mean, the fact that PGIM Global Investment is out there, who typically raises $100 million chunks from sovereign wealth managers out there with an impact fund is a big deal, and I think will have an impact. Without the sort of, work that is being done at the smaller and the medium-sized level, that wouldn't be possible. But, Fran, I wanted to put you on the spot about the intermediary question.
Oh, I wanted to put you guys on the spot about policy.
Oh, okay.
I came in late, because you already addressed this, please.
Do you want to speak in the microphone? They've asked us to do. Okay. We'll repeat it.
So, and forgive me if you've touched on this already, but the Senate tax bill is kind of is being kind of hammered out at this time as we speak. My understanding is that the Senate bill, that Orrin Hatch kind of preserved the low-income housing tax credit, but for the new markets tax credit was sort of like preserved, but it has kind of a stub period of authorization, and then after which it's to be determined. The House bill eviscerated both, and so I think it's good to see that the Senate is taking a somewhat more moderate position. So when you think about the risk of your developments and how reliant or not they are on tax credits, when you think about Section 8, can you just talk a little bit about how that makes you think about the discounted cash flow of new projects and existing projects?
We don't have any opinions on that, I think, right? Doug, do you want to, I see Doug and David talking.
Okay. So Fran, of course, you asked the question that is hot and nobody wants to really touch, but I think I'm going to try. Okay. And I'm going to do it. I'm going to phrase it as people have said, I have heard, many are saying. And the first thing is that we need Fannie, Freddie, and HUD to be viable, and right now HUD is falling apart. Many have said. Particularly when it comes to Section 8 vouchers, they're not getting done. So those supports for affordable housing across cities ain't there, and where the Section 8 vouchers are getting done is, say, in a city like Columbia, Missouri, where rents are so low, Section 8 actually is profitable for a developer to use. But it's not profitable in New York City or Newark or any place like that. You need Fannie and Freddie to be operating well, because if they're not, if they're gutted, if they're remodeled, reformed, then mortgage interest rates will go up. Right? It's the ability for those agencies, those GSEs, to buy big pools of mortgages with certainty allows mortgage interest rates to stay low, and they've actually fallen. Right? So that could go away. The fact that in the East Coast and the blue states, think about what's in that bill and what's proposed. New York sends $4 of taxes to the federal government for every dollar it gets back. Alabama sends $30, 30 cents of taxes for every $4 it gets back. Ain't fair, right? Ain't fair. But the tax bill exaggerates that. No, and by taking away the deductibility in California, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, elsewhere, of local property taxes, state income taxes, local income taxes, it means in order for those blue states, if you will, to stay in a technology curve, they're going to have to raise taxes. And you're not going to get the deduction. Now, if you lose your home mortgage deduction, which they're also talking about, that means the value of your housing is going to come down. Interest rates go up, lost your tax deductions, housing values come down. We're screwed. Some have said this is the worst tax package they've ever seen. Many agree.
So, thanks for the optimistic outlook, Doug. I don't think anything's getting passed myself, but let's assume that something does. As Doug highlights, there are so many sort of fundamental values and programs that will be eviscerated by this tax bill, the low-income housing tax credit is the least of my concerns. And I actually think that's going to get preserved because there's a whole bunch of real estate lobbyists out there working hard for it. So, we can talk about the value of the credit and volume as a result of the reduction of the corporate tax rate, and that's a big complicated hoo-ha that we probably don't need to get into here. But this tax bill is so amazingly problematic in all sorts of ways. The low-income housing tax credit is the least of my concerns about it.
On that note, if you look at any sort of rational economic point of view, you would look at the federal support for housing would include direct and indirect expenditures. And if you look at that from an economic point of view, the indirect expenditure of the mortgage interest deduction is taking federal resources to people like us in this room at the direct expense of people in need across the country. And so tax bill, we'd all vote no. None of us get a vote. It's kind of frustrating. But if you live in New York, be confident you've got 2 senators voting no, and I don't know how many members of the House, but plenty. But, if there's going to be an examination of what we spend money on, why, and how, there's a lot that can be improved upon.
Yeah.
Let me just add to the joy. So I would concur that the tax credit is the least concern, right? And the game really comes down to mayors and their ability to provide, again, land, right? Because land doesn't make you money till you sell it. It's just the cost of the project, so you got to get the land cost down. What is really concerning is the deficit that's going to be created. At $1.5 trillion, there's a crowding out effect. The U.S. GDP is $22 trillion. The national debt's $20 trillion. You add $1.5 trillion, $2 trillion to it, and you now have 100% of GDP servicing the national debt. And that crowding out effect means if I'm going to invest money because it's a rising interest rate market in order to borrow that money to finance the government, I'm going to invest it in treasury bonds, right? That's the risk-free rate. And that sucks money out of the economy. But the good thing is mayors have tools. This is the optimistic point.
Yeah.
Right? Mayors have tools. Mayors can do tax increment financing. They can do tax abatements. They have all kinds of things they can do to help that project get started. And that's where the ground game is going to be. It's going to be knowing your mayor, knowing your city council, knowing your planning and zoning people, knowing your just knowing the people that can say yes.
How about some other questions? Imogen told me that we had to talk about Puerto Rico, but we can go there if you like. But
I'm curious about, I didn't get to the first name of the gentleman from Bridges talked about
Michael,
this particularly. But I would know everyone's perspective is, I was in the urban panel earlier this morning, and we were talking about, I wanted to kind of get to the question of the kind of cities that are getting over-invested in and over-focused on, New York, Boston, they're getting out of Louisville. So, someone is ready to throw in the towel on New York. What's the next layer that's where there's interesting things happening, where there's jobs?
That's a great question, and it's a false alarm. That's one we think about a lot, and I love to think about. I think in housing in every sector, this economy has been, or this cycle has been about flight to quality, better getting better, the rich getting richer. That's happened in real estate. That's why Class A is oversupplied and workforce is undersupplied. So that's happened with cities to a large extent too. We could never lose our money buying at a 3 cap in San Francisco. We'll see. I think we kind of divide cities into buckets that we call transitioning and high growth. So, there's some exceptions, but kind of your Sun Belt, high growth, overwhelming growth markets. A lot of interesting markets where one concept I've struggled to get comfortable with, but we have to, is lifestyle leading jobs instead of the other way around. You see that in Denver, Nashville, Austin. And then you see kind of the proliferation of all sorts of, the tech growth in Austin and Nashville. So these aren't secrets. These are markets everyone's excited about. and, even quote unquote dumber capital than ours is starting to go to those places. I think there's a lot under the surface to macro data for some of the Rust Belt cities, especially those that kind of are leaning on their institutions and their academic institutions to reemerge. Certain markets may have a top line employment growth less than the country's, but when you dig in, productivity factors, real GDP per capita, things like that are showing growth. So you're shedding this exoskeleton of, old economy jobs, and, places like Pittsburgh, even Baltimore with Hopkins, Pittsburgh with Carnegie Mellon, all this growth is kind of emanating out of these urban halos at these universities. So we actually think there's, some of the transitioning markets, we look at it and say, unless the mayor sets this up for us, we're not going to make our returns. But some we think are competitive even with high growth markets, and it's just kind of bubbling under the surface. And then we love the Atlantas and the Nashvilles because, it's cheap. People can live there, and they like living there.
Just as a quick comment, it's interesting because we take a slightly different view, and it's probably just a function of like where we are, just being in Silicon Valley. And it's all about. I'm originally from Toronto, so you can't call me Silicon Valley all the way through. But I think that technology is a really interesting force, and it's been at play for the last 200 years, and it's like a concentrating force. It's concentrating across a whole bunch of different industries, largely because it's deflationary, largely. There's a whole kind of sequence of reasons why that's the case. And it's funny because the only thing that technology does not make less expensive is ultimately land, like near the places in which technology companies thrive. I think that cities are largely getting in their own way when it comes to managing that growth. I think that I'm also terrified for our like San Francisco investments, but it has nothing to do with the underlying forces. It has everything to do with the mayors and everything to do with the other people that are essentially getting in the way of having these vibrant, growing places. And as a result, I think places like Denver, Seattle, essentially Austin, all these places that people are flighting to have an opportunity to emerge as these other growing, vibrant places that wouldn't exist if the Bay Area got their act together and actually built the appropriate amount of housing and all those other pieces.
For me, the essence of your question is one of the most interesting things about this whole field, because you had over 50 years where the private capital and the public sector were fully aligned, hand hip to hip, screw the cities and let's make the suburbs work. And that was fine with private investors, and it was clearly fine with the federal government. And you can just go down A to Z, everything that was done to make cities difficult and suburbs easy. And you had a few people, some foundations, and some mayors that were trying to do stuff in the cities, but it was really hard, and we all know the results. Today, you can say with a fair amount of certainty that the private markets are all in for cities. Right? I mean, millennials are living in cities, investors are living in cities, European investors are investing in cities. The suburbs have a lot of challenges. What the public sector in this environment is going to do to recognize what's happening by people's choice and, what's leading and how the private sector is leading is a complete TBD at the state level, federal level, and local level as well. And to bring it all back around, it's why the initiatives that are taken by impact investors have such a sort of leveraged and fulcrum effect, where if you can come into an urban environment and show that there's a way to participate in the growth and the demographics and in the growing wealth, but do it in a way that contributes to affordability and a more diverse economic base for the cities, it sets up a precedent where significant additional dollars might flow in the near future.
To follow up what David's saying, 82% of Americans live in cities. 82%. And when you look at the number of millennials and what's the generation right after them? Is that
Z.
Z? Can't leave home. right? They're in the basement, they can't leave, or they come back, right? So it used to be you could buy a house on one income, then it became you had to be married and have two people, and now you have, a DI 1K, double income, one kid, right? And you'll eventually need three people to buy a home if this keeps trending. We cut markets up a little bit differently than you were talking about. We've identified 54 cities based on their sustainability planning and energy benchmarking, and they're forward thinking about how they're going to deal with carbon. We think carbon's a proxy for you reduce carbon, you get a more efficient something. And efficiency matters, right, because it reduces cost. So one of the cities we like, if you've got a university, a good university system that works well, that's a huge multiplier, like you're saying. We like St. Louis. St. Louis has got a lot of land. It's extremely cheap. The U.S. military is all in St. Louis right now. The Air Force is building a 2 million square foot geospatial intelligence agency, which is to track all the spy satellites around the globe. That's a multi-billion-dollar project. The University of Missouri, Washington University, they've all formed a consortium called the Cortrex, which is tech. And they're creating jobs. They're no longer, you think about the Midwest and your images of trains leaving Cleveland or Toledo, and the longer the train, the better that economy was. The shorter the train, the worse the economy. Where are they shipping that? To the East Coast, to the West Coast. Well, guess what? St. Louis isn't doing that anymore. They want to be the next Silicon Valley. But it's a hell of a lot cheaper to do it from St. Louis, which is a 2-hour flight from almost anywhere, than it is from San Francisco.
Yeah, so we've talked about the first-tier cities, the second-tier cities, which we could totally talk about forever. I'm going to bring it back around, as Imogen asked, to Puerto Rico and Detroit, which is that those are places that have not yet been ready for investment, that have severe fiscal challenges. And I think from my time at the Ford Foundation, what I would say about those places is that you actually have to lead with philanthropic and public sector investment. And the most important investment on the front end, I think, in those places is policy and civil society. And once there's philanthropic investment to rebuild the political capacity of people to lobby for their own, to receive the resources that they are entitled to as part of this country, that then you have a situation, then you begin to have a situation where you can bring in private investment like that's represented on the stage. And, we've seen that in Detroit with a lot of, with the grand bargain and the resolution of the bankruptcy, a lot of philanthropic investment. And I think Detroit is still 5 or 7 years between the real estate cost curve and the value curve crossing, but it's coming. And in those places, what we have to be conscious of is we have an opportunity to build an equitable society instead of a Silicon Valley, and we have to be forward thinking about that. I think we have to do that in Puerto Rico too. So 5 years from now, we'll have a panel about Detroit and Puerto Rico. Anyway, thank you all very much. Really appreciate your time. Thanks to the panelists.